So in terms of how the tree then gets its shape, we now know how it's multiplying its roots, how it's multiplying its shoots, and how it's getting water up so that it can make more food and continue to exist in the air. Why does it have the shape it does? That's a thing that becomes important to us because especially when we're planting trees, we depend upon we want them to have certain shapes, we want those shapes to be strong, we want them to be durable, and we want them to fit where we're going to plant them. So it's important to know how this happens too. So the rate of growth is going to depend on how good the environment is and on the genetics of the plant. Habit of growth is fairly characteristic of different species, as we'll see in a minute. And then there are all the accident. What happens to a tree by accident? What also happens to it if we're buying trees? For those of us who have to go and do this, it's very important to look at what happened to the tree in the nursery. Because you can see 2 or 3 different trees. They each have the same caliper size. One is a wonderful tree, one is okay, and one should be thrown away because of the way they were trained in the nursery. Because trees don't just naturally appear in the nursery people train them to have a particular shape. And they use knowledge of the way trees, or they should be using knowledge of the ways trees respond to accidents. So you do get unique individuals out of these same repeated parts with trees. I'm just going to briefly show you this because these are 3 sugar maples in the same cemetery as that great tree I just showed you, my favorite tree. They were planted at the same time. They're not as big in caliper. They're planted close together, so they have very different habit. But they've also suffered. You see what's happened to them? See that? That's a power line. So they've suffered from a lot of bad pruning over the years in order to keep them away from the power lines. So even though these trees are the close relatives of the first tree I showed you, probably came from the same nursery at the same size with similar potentialities, turned out to be a very different tree because of the things that happened to them afterwards. So here's just typical ways, different branch angle that develops in nature. An ash tree will generally be much more upright than a hickory tree, for example. And oaks will be much more rounded will have a more rounded crown on the top, generally speaking. So branches change, grow, change, and die through the life of a tree. They have to support themselves with their own photosynthesis. What's left over from their photosynthesis, they then export to the rest of the tree. So there's a lot of the tree that can't make its own food. The trunk, the roots can't make their own food. But the food that is made for them is made in the branches. But the branches have to make their own food first. If they can't, they die. So shaded branches will often die out for that reason. They're just not making enough food to support themselves, and the tree's not going to support them if they're not producing enough to give a little extra to the rest of the tree or even to support themselves. So away they grow. But one of the things that is important to realize this about in terms of those of us who go out and prune trees, whether we're pruning them to train them in the nursery or pruning them in the landscape, is when we prune a branch to a shorter length, we're taking leaves off it so it'll grow more slowly. When you pruned or wounded branches, we'll do a couple of different things, and this is very important both in terms of our pruning and in terms of training young trees. When you prune a tree, it will activate, if it needs to, it will activate buds that have never sprouted. Reserve buds, suppressed buds, dormant buds, they're called. Sometimes if it has to, it will use the cambium to create brand new ones. A lot of times when you see suckers in a crabapple, all those little tiny sprouts coming up in them, they're coming up for that reason. They're coming up because they were newly created. And mainly what we do in pruning mature trees is we're trying to prune them so that the tree structure will stay the same and existing branches will take over the role of what we removed. So those are the 3 different ways that a pruned or wounded branch can respond. I just want to show you this because it's also quite cool. The suppressed bud, this is an example of a suppressed bud. It's a bud that started long, long ago, and 10 or 12 years later, it's still keeping out at the, so this is each year of this is an annual growth ring, right? So 12 years later, it's still a bud. It never sprouted. And it may never sprout unless, well, this is the other cool thing about suppressed buds is they can fork. So inside the tree, back here we had 1 suppressed bud, 1 dormant bud. It became 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dormant buds. And if it keeps going, it may be 8 or 12 before it gets out there. Same here is 1 coming into 2, coming into 3 dormant buds. This is very useful to a tree when somebody does something like that to it. This is a honey locust that someone decided to get rid of because they were, I think it was in the way of their construction project across the street. They thought they were getting rid of it, no such luck. Because the base of the honey locust tree was just full of dormant and suppressed buds. They cut it down. There was plenty of energy stored in the roots, and cabango, back it came. And I would have moved the street to keep this happening because it was making a beautiful multi-stem honey locust. Unfortunately, they later had to remove it because it was taking over the street. People couldn't walk by or drive by. But you see that, you know, trees have this enormous resilience and ability to make up for what has happened to them. So we can use these facts both to help us form trees in the nursery so that they'll be good to start with, and also to help us learn how to take care of them when they come out of the nursery. The skill of the nurseryman is often knowing how to shape a young tree so it will have beautiful and lasting form. So when we're giving trees real care, loving care, responsive care, care that looks at what they need and responds to it, we have to pay attention to a few things. We have to pay attention to the soils, the quality of the soils, but also how much soil we're giving them. In the past, we've given trees tiny quantities of soil in the city very often and asked them to live long lives, and they just don't like to do it. If they do it by attacking our sewer systems, which is, as far as I'm concerned, not a bad thing, but probably not good for the sewer system. We have to look to some extent at species and cultivars because you can't, for example, plant a tree that hates salt like a sugar maple on the street. And one of the things that happens in my area up in upstate New York is the streets were once lined with sugar maples, and some of those sugar maples are still there, but they planted them in the teens, and ever since they've been salting, the sugar maples have been declining, and you see them looking worse and worse and worse. So you have to plant trees that are of a species and cultivar that are appropriate for what they're for. Very important to select good form, a tree that has been well trained, not poorly trained in the nursery. Then you have to plant the tree properly. It's not just a matter generally of shoving it in the ground. I also want to look at some of the alternatives that we have to give trees more soil, a little bit at caring for them afterwards, and also one thing I didn't put in here was finding ways to use more of the water that falls on the street to feed the tree, and also to increase the rate of transpiration and the passage of water back into the air instead of it's being lost in the rivers and the sewers. So let's look. Good soil. It's important to realize, I have this problem with a set of trees. Someone asked me to look at 7 trees in containers at Harry Winston's jeweler on 5th Avenue, all dead. 7, this beautiful, you know, fancy-dancy jeweler. I probably can't afford to walk through the door. But they had 7 dead yew trees that had been planted that spring. So they called me as a consultant and said, why did our yew trees die? I said, interesting question. I poked around in their soils a bit. They had used an extremely, extremely high organic matter planting soil. In fact, it was so high that when I sent the soil off for testing, I said I wanted a soil organic matter reading, and a cooperative extension people called me and said, you know, we can do that, but I don't think you'll get anything else. If I like this, normally they take soil organic matter by weighing the soil first, then burning off the organic matter and weighing it again. She said, if I burn off that organic matter, they're going to give me anything left. So this soil was entirely organic, right? So organic matter is great in moderation, but organic matter in that amount is terribly badly drained. So these trees were drowned. Beautiful trees drowned simply by a bad choice of soil. So when we're doing, we want to make sure that the soil has a good quality, and things to give soil good quality are making sure it has pretty high organic matter, but not more than 10%. Usually 5% is good by weight. More than 10% is going to create a lot of changes in the structure, because when it eventually will break down. As it breaks down, you'll lose soil structure. You want to have pretty low clay, and you want to be high in sand, particularly high in coarse sand, so that you can have a soil that will be well drained. Unless, of course, you're working with a plant that likes, like bald cypress. Well, bald cypress can be a very good city tree because it will live no matter what. It will live, you know, it will live in the middle of a swamp, and so will a pin oak where we are, probably not here. So this is typically in nature. That's a nice idealized picture of a soil with its organic layer and its A layer and its B layer, and this is a tree will just be so happy in this soil. The soils we have in the city are much more like Calvin and Hobbes soils. You're digging the hole here. He says, so what did he find? I can't read it over there. A few dirty rocks, a weird root, all kinds of grubs. Well, that's pretty nice soil comparatively. He says, oh, you found that in your first, oh yeah, there's treasure everywhere. Well, that's the treasure in Calvin and Hobbes' soil. The treasure that I find in New York City soils is more like this. I sometimes am digging and I find an old roadbed. I was digging in Flushing Meadow Park. We had to transplant a large number of crab apples, one of which was the lone survivor from the 1938 World's Fair. We dug down about 6 inches and we hit solid ash with the little bits of porcelain and other goodies and bits of brick and stuff in it. And somebody who was on the job said, yeah, this is the Valley of Ashes. I said, what? You ever read The Great Gatsby? The Valley of Ashes, he often, when he's driving into New York City, he always talks about passing the Valley of Ashes. Well, they built the World's Fair on top of Gatsby's Valley of Ashes. And it's true. When you try and dig down there, you find that you've got ashes underneath. Battery Park is a whole beautiful park in the south end of New York. Wasn't there. It's all fill soil, 30, 40 feet of fill soil. And there are all these lands that Robert Moses made called the Made Lands, because he made them by taking old roads and buildings and things he wanted to get rid of and dumping them in salt marshes. And they have pH 8 and up, more like 9.5. So they're very hard places to grow things. So we often in cities get very strange treasures in our soils. So it pays a great deal of attention to pay attention to what we're planting into and to test it. Say, what is this that I've got here? Now, it's not to say that the Valley of Ashes was turned out to be a pretty good growing medium. There's only one problem. When Hurricane Irene came, the whole thing went liquid because the ashes were not a good place for roots. The roots were very superficial, so 60 and 70 foot tall lindens were torn out of the ground. Silver lindens were torn out of the ground by the winds. Because they weren't able to send their roots deeper because of the ashes. But it was pretty well drained. So, you know, it doesn't mean just because you've got something strange in there you can't grow with it. But you should know what it is and you should be working with it. But even more important than that is the volume of soil we're giving to the trees. I mean, these are plants that are wanting to take a tremendous amount of water out of the soils. If we don't give them enough soil to take it out of, they're really in trouble. They will either die or they'll find a way out of where we put them. So here's an idea that was developed by Nina Basak at Cornell of about how much soil a tree of a different size needs. A tree of 4-inch caliper, that is 4-inch diameter trunk, needs about 200 square feet of soil. By the time you get up to 16-inch, which is a medium to tall, you know, mature street tree, you need 1,000 square feet of soil would be what the tree would like. Those are typical tree pits. I understand you, in Louisville, you often use 4x4s. I'm not sure they're up there, but there's, of all the different pit sizes that are listed there, that's the amount of soil they're giving. That is not enough soil to make even a 4-inch caliper tree happy. So the trees are going to be heading out of those soils somewhere else as quickly as they can get there. Now, that's not to say they won't survive it. Trees are great survivors, but in terms of our hospitality to them, we're not doing anything good for them by putting in things this small. So we need to, if we can, give them more. There's an example of what a 16-inch tree needs and what we typically give it. And you see it, this is just in my neighborhood. Here's 2 pagoda trees. This one was planted before this one. This one is struggling. This is planted about a year before this one. This one is struggling to reach maybe, I think when it was planted it was about so tall, and now it's about so tall 5 years later. This one was planted at a smaller size than this and is now about 25 to 30 feet tall. Now, one thing is, this is in front of a Zen temple. So, you know, the Zen people, I think, are sending in extremely good thoughts at all times. And that probably helps, but they also, their thoughts were reflected in their actions, which is, instead of the 5x5 tree pit of the little one, they had a 5x20 foot tree pit. One of the things is choosing trees that like to live in cities. Now, I was talking downstairs with some people about ailanthus trees. Up where I live, ailanthus trees love to live in cities. They're the tree that grows in Brooklyn. They're otherwise known as a ghetto palm or lot palm. They'll grow anywhere. I've seen them growing out of the air ducts of subways. I've seen them growing off cornices on roofs. They're amazing trees. They're also extremely invasive and nasty because they spread all kinds of seed all over. Their strategy is, who cares if I live or die? I'm going to reproduce so prolifically, I'll have 100 of me back, you know, within 20 feet. So that's cool, but it's not good for us. But now they're thinking, now they're trying to breed male clones of ailanthus, because a few people have said, you know, it's great when we're planting natives, it's great when we're planting trees that we admire for their qualities, but there are admirable qualities to an ailanthus tree, and one of it is that it can actually survive city conditions very, very well. So if we could make a male clone of ailanthus trees that wouldn't do this thing of spreading itself all over the place, well, maybe we'd have an option for those places that are very difficult to grow any tree at all. So But generally speaking, if we're looking for trees in cities, we'll be looking for trees that are trees that are pretty tolerant where they grow in nature. So you'll find that oftentimes trees that we grow on city streets are trees that in nature would grow in the floodplain. They can tolerate salt and pollutants because that's what they'll get out of the river. They can tolerate it when it's flooded, and they can tolerate it when it's dry. And a lot of our trees, interestingly, swamp white oak, pin oak is a swamp plant, red maples are swamp plants. A lot of plants that do well in lowland. Bald cypress turns out to be a fabulous street tree, and they're all things that can tolerate the floodplain. Drought-tolerant species often are savanna-source trees, and the best shade trees we find are usually understory species in nature. So if you're reading through books and looking for what might be a good tree to put in your landscape, that's a good way to look at it and say, well, where does this grow in nature? Because according to where it grows in nature, it may be a good or not tree. So I'm going to skip through these so that we can go on to other things. Oh, yeah, okay, now here. So whatever tree you may end up choosing, what you want is a tree with a good shape, with a clear leader, good branch spacing, good branch angles, wider branch angles, not branch angles like this. Trees where the training is finished. You can often get trees out of a nursery where they're just kind of getting rid of them and there are recent pruning cuts on them. You don't know what the effect of those pruning cuts will be. You shouldn't buy them. And where there really is a root flare and there are no kinks, no kinked roots visible on the top. So just quickly, this is a tree with really nice structure. Has a good central leader. The branches are pretty well spaced. They're at pretty wide angles. Here's a tree with just terrifyingly bad structure. All the branches are emerging from the same place. They're all at steep angles. And they don't really develop good lateral branches because while these are lateral branches growing around a trunk, they're called codominant stems, which means none of them is content to be a branch. Each one of them wants to be the leader. So they go, no, I'm first. No, I'm first. No, so they grow in competition with one another. They create terrible problems. So this is, you all who are arborists may recognize this. This is a Bradford Callery pear, which in New York City streets is no longer allowed to be planted. They actually bred a tree to do that. But they fall apart. They literally fall apart in wind and storm. So they stopped doing that. So here's but this is the difference of what you can find in a nursery. This is actually a tree still being trained, a very young tree that's just stopped being a whipped and they've just selected the branches on it in a nursery. Nurserymen will often create a tree by making cuts in the middle of a branch and trying to stimulate the production of lateral branches. That'll happen if you make a cut, say, here. If I make a cut there, the tree's probably just going to go that way. If I make a cut here, I'll probably get some dormant buds sprouting here and here. So nurserymen depend upon that when they're training a tree. You can see how those have had cuts made on them. What the nurseryman wants is for lateral branches to develop there, and then he'll have a tree that looks more or less like that when he sells it and puts it out on the street. And this one is a linden that has a really nice central leader and pretty well-spaced branches. But this is another linden, about the same size. It's a disaster. And look at it. What happened is the nurseryman came in there and made one cut and then went away and didn't come back until the tree was of a size sufficient to sell and sold it. It's the same caliper size, would probably cost about the same amount in the nursery, but this tree should never have come out of the nursery. This is a very weak structure. It's going to go away in the first storm. Well, not the first, but in a storm soon. This is not a structure that's going to live very long, so you want to be looking for good structure in the crown when you're buying a tree. But when you're buying or planting trees, you want to be looking for trees that have a good root system, because underground is just as important, and probably even more important than above ground. But the problem is they're harder to see. And sometimes there's really, really an epidemic of girdling roots now, so you have to be extremely careful with it. It often happens because they start the tree in a tiny pot, and you can see in there how there's a kink right there. That was in a little 1-gallon pot. And then there's another set of kinked encircling roots when it was in the 3- or 5-gallon pot. And then there's a whole other set of them when it was in the largest pot. So by the time it gets out in the landscape, it's a mass of roots that are circling instead of going out. And that may not be a problem for you in the first 3 or 4 years of the tree, but as it gets older, it can be the disaster. This is just examples of what happens. Here's one that I was called to look at. This tree probably ended up, by the time they planted it, cost $1,500. It's a large, a beautiful cultivar called Aconita folium of Japanese maple, a beautiful, beautiful plant. And the designers called me and said, the plant's dying, we don't know why. Well, it was pretty clear. I looked first and I said, verticillium wilt. There were a couple of disease options, but then I looked down. I saw that. I went, uh-oh. See that? That's not part of the trunk, that's part of the roots. So I scraped away a little, and I started to see more of what looked like a girdling root. Now, you can do this in the nursery. So if you're going into a nursery and looking for a plant, the first thing you should do with the root system is scrape away a little bit and see. And if you see anything like this kind of circling or something that instead of going out is going around, then you know that you have some questions. If you're going to buy it, you're going to say to the nurseryman, I think there are girdling roots in this. I want you to guarantee that you will take it back from me if it doesn't thrive. But this is what happened when we took the soil away from that plant. So instead of having what you expect, you know, that picture I showed you before of the roots extending out into the landscape, they were all going round and round and round. Sometimes with girdling roots, you can cure them. Sometimes you can't. In this is a case you can't. They lost the plant. There's just no way to cure them. Sometimes this happens when the trees, the girdling roots may have been farther out, so it happens farther out on the stem. This is a tree, a beautiful, mature Japanese maple that was starting to show early. You can see that nobody else has turned fall color. This was, I think, in August. We're having fall color on this maple. So looking closely at it, we began to find girdling roots. But again, girdling roots at the layer of a 12-inch or 14-inch diameter plant, not at the layer of it. So it's something very, very important to keep an eye out for. It can happen at a very early stage. There's the beginning of one that may not affect the tree for 5 years. One way to deal with these is, the old way to deal with them was to slice through the roots. They said just make those slicing cuts and that'll help. It don't. It don't help at all. The better thing to do is to edge prune, to prune the edges away so you get anything that's girdling off. And also, if you see like big roots that have come out and are bending down and under, in many cases you can simply prune them back to where they're going in the direction they ought to be going again. Edge pruning the tree so that you'll get roots going in the correct direction. It's better than leaving something that's going to send roots round and around and kill the plant. So let's look a little bit at planting properly. We want to have a stable base. We want to find the first lateral root and plant it at or near the surface. We want to remove, you don't have to remove all the burlap and the wire. We like to because we like to just recycle them. You don't want to plant too deep because planting too deep is a major cause of girdling roots that happen after you plant. And you want to make sure that when you're planting in a planting hole that you make interfaces in the soil. The soil that you get in the nursery is probably not the same as the soil you're planting in. And you want the tree to be able to get across that interface between the two different kinds of soil. So typically what you'll do is at least rough up the soil of the planting hole so it's easier for the roots to get out there. And sometimes we'll go in there and then we'll start cutting around the edge of the root ball once it's in the ground and then mixing the soil on the edge between the root ball soil and the soil that is already in the planting hole. So we're doing, when we're taking a tree out, balling it in burlap, we're taking a lot of its roots out, typically 70 to 90%. So we want to give it the best shot possible to send those roots back out again. There's a good example of where the roots actually are. You can see that in this case they're very near the surface. This is bare root planting, by the way, which is a lot of fun. I'll talk about it in a moment if I have a time. But you can see the first major lateral root is here. So we want that first lateral root to be at or near the surface, no matter what. Okay? This is sometimes made more difficult by the fact that nowadays, because of the way plants are grown, typically in nurseries in Oregon when they're very young, they may have very long root shanks on them. You'll see that this plant has a little bit of a root shank, but basically it has good lateral roots coming out of a swelling base. But here, this may have been the original position of the tree, but the roots are coming out way down here. It's kind of, there's a reason this happens, and they're trying to change it, but you need to be aware of it, and you need to be looking when you're planting trees to make sure that if you're planting it up here, there's 6 inches of root shank like this or like that. That may make it very hard for the roots that are there to get water and oxygen. So you need to find where the roots are. Best way to do that, this is a tree that we found planted in the Bronx. This is my surveyor stake, which is 12 inches long. 11 inches of that surveyor stake went into the ground before I found the first root on this tree. So this tree's long-term prognosis is poor. On the other hand, this tree that was planted very near it, yeah, we got about an inch down is the first lateral root. That's good. That's what we want. We'll often test, when we have Walden burlap plants, we'll test them by using this in the field. Before we go out to plant, we'll find that first lateral root so we know exactly where we want to plant at. And then we'll just quickly take a look at going out in the field to plant. We try to take the whole basket out. We do that by cutting the bottom off first and leaving the top on to hold the root ball like that. Then putting it in the ground, cutting the rest of the metal off, then cutting back the burlap. And we typically try and pull all of it out of the hole. You probably don't have to do that. You can probably just cut the first third to 2/3 off. We like to get it all out because we like to recycle it. Nature will recycle it as long as it's real burlap and not that white treated burlap, which will not decay. But we like to try and take all of it off. It's much harder to do that. If the soil of the root ball is a sandy soil, it can be harder to do that. We try and get it all off just to be clean about it, and then ultimately to plant it and stake it in the ground. And with the first lateral root, very important, the first lateral root at or near the surface. Deep planting slows the growth, girdling roots, may create that hinge I showed you a few minutes ago, creates the depth that water has to penetrate, and it also encourages pathogens on the trunk. Watering is the most important thing for newly planted trees, particularly newly planted trees in the street. Never mind that this is a ridiculously small amount of soil. All the more reason you have to make sure it gets proper water. For a small tree, like a 2.5-inch or 3-inch diameter tree, 20 gallons of planting, 20 gallons per week are good. A study was done in Florida of trees where they, in the first year, 100% of the ones that were watered weekly survived, 60% of the ones that were not watered died. So it makes the biggest difference is to provide proper water for trees. An alternative to doing, and this is a very interesting alternative for community planting, is to do trees bare root. There are nurseries that will dig a tree bare root for you. And Nina Bassick invented a way by dipping them in this is a slurry of hydrogel. This is fun, by the way. It's a great party. We would go to this nursery and have dipping parties where we would have a barn full of several hundred bare root trees. And this thing, and we would all go out and dip and sing and have it was really quite a wonderful time. The only problem with these is these are great things to do as community plantings because the people who are in the community can actually plant them. They don't just have to watch while we with the machine are putting it in the ground. I've seen, you know, 6th graders walk with 2.5-inch caliper trees on their shoulders down the street and put them in the ground and see exactly where the lateral roots are and see exactly how, and then they put the soil in and then they'd make sure that the soil was right up against the roots so that there'd be a good marriage between the soil and the roots. They understood a lot by doing this. The flaw in that plan was that the custodians in New York don't want any extra work. So we found in some cases where somebody took over the summer work and the summer watering, they were fine. Where they didn't, the trees perished. But this is, I think, a very interesting alternative for doing community planting. You can also do it with trees that you buy out of the nursery, bolt and burlap. You can bare root them. Particularly if you suspect girdling root problems, that can be a very useful thing to do. Bare root them, find the root problems, deal with the root problems, and then plant the trees. Am I getting to 12:30? Good. Okay, we'll look last but not least at ways we can finally give trees the amount of soil they want. Typically, when you put trees on the streets, you have to compact all the soil around them so strongly that the roots can't penetrate it. But there are other things we can do now to allow us to either place something in the soil that the roots can get through, that it's not exactly a soil but close enough, or we can actually find ways to have soils that are not compacted. This is a study done by Bartlett. I think you can find this online, so I won't pause over it. They did it at Bartlett Tree Research Labs. They looked at things with suspended pavements, things that were done with Cornell structural soil and with other means of not compacting soils. And they found that very different growing conditions were created by these, and particularly the ones in the suspended pavements do well. This is Cornell structural soil, which is made out of a rough, large gravel together with a small amount of soil and hydrogel. There's questions about how well this will work with mature trees, but you can plate it along a city street, and you can then compact it to the proper compaction for putting down the sidewalk, but because it's made of this large aggregate, there's still voids in it that the roots can get through. So it's a very good way to let roots get through even when they must be under sidewalks. And it's particularly good when, say, you had that situation like we saw over at the Sunnyside Gardens project, where there's more soil just over here but a sidewalk in between. If you put structural soil here, it'll be very easy for the roots to get through here without lifting the pavement and get over to the soils over here. So, love of trees. What's not to love?
We'll do a few questions and answers. Let's thank Bill again for a very informative, good presentation.